The sound you just heard was the radio signal transmitted from Sputnik, the first artificial satellite launched in the Earth's orbit. Despite only lasting 92 days, it created a panic within the United States and its allies that ignited the space race. This is the story of Sputnik and other notable satellites launched into orbit during this time period and the impacts on history. The idea of artificial satellites was not limited to the 20th century. German astronomer Johannes Kepler created the term satellite in 1610. Isaac Newton presented the first explanation of orbital motion in his book Principia Mathematica in 1687. Newton suggested that a cannonball fired with enough gunpowder would fall but never reach the ground. In 1869, writer Edward Everett Hale published a short science fiction story called The Brick Moon, which included the first depiction of an artificial satellite. In the early 1900s, Russian mathematics teacher Konstantin Tsiolkovsky realized that a giant rocket was the only practical machine that could boost a satellite into the atmosphere. Near the end of World War II, the Nazi scientists were beginning to build powerful rockets that would someday prove him right. German scientist Wernher von Braun developed a 28,000-pound rocket engine named the V2. Thousands of these vengeance weapons were thrust upon Europe. At the close of World War II, the Soviet Union, United Kingdom, and the US were involved in a race to capture scientists. Von Braun surrendered to the U.S. troops in 1945. During the early stages of the Cold War, launching a satellite was not a U.S. priority. In fact, in 1947, only $47 million had been budgeted for missile development. Von Braun's proposals for new rockets and ideas for space travel never got off the ground. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union's focus was on developing missiles. However, things changed in 1956. Russian Premier Khrushchev granted chief designer Sergei Korolev permission to launch a satellite as long as it did not interfere with missile development. This decision and work of Sergei Korolev and his team forever changed history. Sputnik, the Russian word for satellite, was launched by the USSR on October 4, 1957. Korolev instructed his team to make the satellite entirely of a highly reflective aluminum material. This would ensure that it could be seen over enemy territory. Almost the entire 184-pound mass was dedicated to radio transmitters and batteries. American politicians initially dismissed the importance of the launch. Senator Wiley of Wisconsin called it a propaganda stunt. Defense Secretary Wilson called it a neat technical trick. However, the media and the public reacted differently. The reporter called it a great national emergency, and the New York Herald Tribune called it a grave defeat. Democrats were painting President Eisenhower as a modern-day Nero who golfed while America burned. The Russians quickly launched another satellite on November 3rd, the 1,100-pound Sputnik 2. The satellite contained the first animal in space, a dog named Laika. On November 7th, President Eisenhower addressed a worried nation. He emphasized America's military might, congratulated Soviet scientists for their achievement, and laid out his plans. Meanwhile, America was having difficulty with its satellite program. In 1955, the Pentagon chose the Navy's Vanguard project over Army and Air Force proposals. Its goal was to launch a satellite during the International Geophysical Year. However, Vanguard's budget was once at $20 million, would surpass $110 million, over twice the estimated cost of the first Sputnik. Vanguard's long-awaited launch was on December 6, 1958. Cape Canaveral in Florida was chosen as the launch site. The launch was a disaster. Flopnik, Splatnik, Dunnik, and Goofnik were just a few of the newspaper headlines. The Army was next up to the launch pad. On January 31, 1958, the U.S. successfully launched Explorer 1 upon von Braun's rocket. Explorer 1 weighed only 11 pounds but made a significant discovery: the confirmation of the existence of radiation belts in the atmosphere. Time magazine featured von Braun on the cover. The U.S. launched a series of Explorer satellites that made significant contributions to science. In 1958, Explorer 4 monitored the nuclear explosion of Project Argus. In 1959, Explorer 6 produced the first orbital photographs of Earth. Explorer 7 was the first satellite to measure the solar radiation reflected off the Earth's atmosphere. Explorer 17 also studied the Earth's atmosphere. Despite further launch failures, Vanguard was finally placed into orbit on March 17, 1958. It featured the first solar-powered cells. These cells have been invaluable, providing satellites and spacecraft a long-lived power source. The Soviet Union only launched one satellite in 1958, Sputnik 3. U.S. funding for the National Science Foundation tripled after Sputnik. The National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958 created NASA. These initiatives helped steer the best students toward math, science, and engineering. The first satellite launched by NASA was Pioneer 1 on October 11, 1958. Satellites launched during the space race helped exchange information about Earth, leading to advancements in weather forecasting. The first weather satellite launched into orbit was Vanguard 2. However, it operated for only 18 days. The world's first successful satellite launch was TIROS 1. TIROS took over 22,000 photos of Earth's cloud cover. It allowed meteorologists to study the clouds and patterns on a global view. Beginning in 1962, other countries besides the U.S. began to build satellites. The U.S. teamed with the UK to build Ariel 1. The Canadians became the first non-superpower to design and build a satellite with Alouette. On March 16, 1962, the Soviets successfully launched the first satellite in the Cosmos series. They would eventually launch over 2,000 in the series. Satellites launched during the space race also exchanged information in new ways and changed communications forever. Echo 1, a 100-foot diameter balloon, was the first passive communications satellite. Shortly after launch, a message previously recorded by President Eisenhower was bounced off Echo 1 and picked up by radio operators across the nation. It also sent a speed mail message from Postmaster General Summerfield to the American public. AT&T's Telstar, launched into orbit on July of 1962, was the first satellite built and paid by a private company. It featured one television channel as well as voice circuits for communication. Satellites have also been important for surveillance. Discoverer 1, part of the Corona Spy program, was the first launch of an American military photo surveillance satellite. In 1960, Discoverer 13 was the first successful recovery of a spacecraft from orbit. The film from Discoverer 14 was returned to Earth and retrieved from an airplane. In the late 1960s, the superpowers began to develop anti-satellite technology. In 1968, Cosmos 252 successfully accomplished the first anti-satellite interceptor mission. In 1962, the Navy launched the first navigational satellite, Transit 1B. Today, there are thousands of satellites orbiting the Earth, exploring and exchanging information. They study the Earth's surface and collect scientific data. They relay TV, radio, phone, and internet signals to our homes. They collect weather data that we can check on our smartphones. They help airplanes, ships, and cars navigate. They are the big reason for today's wireless age. Kepler, Newton, Hale, Tsiolkovsky, Korolev, von Braun, and many of the others had a vision. Numerous obstacles were encountered along the way. But one day, nearly 6 decades ago, changed the world forever by sending ideas into space.